Good afternoon and welcome to today's EPA Sustainable Materials Management Web Academy webinar. Today we'll hear from the State of Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality on their wasted food strategy, current work, recent research, and next steps. This webinar is sponsored by the EPA Sustainable Materials Management Web Academy. My name is George Burgos and I'll be managing the technical aspects of today's webinar. While we wait for the others to log on, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Right now, you should have the GoToWebinar application running and should see the welcome presentation on your screen. If you're having technical difficulties using the GoToWebinar, you can go to www.gotowebinar.com and click on the FAQs in the blue navigation bar on the left side of the page. A copy of the presentation slides can be found in your handout box on your screen. We encourage you to ask questions in response to what you hear in the webinar. To do so, please use the GoToWebinar control panel and type your question in the area that says questions. Click Send It to submit it to the moderator. Please type your questions throughout the presentation. We'll have a question and answer session at the conclusion of today's presentation. After today's seminar, there will be a short evaluation. Please take a moment to fill it out. Your feedback is vital to helping us provide the highest quality speakers and information to meet your needs. Today's seminar will be moderated by Elena Goldstein and Chris Carosello of EPA. I will now turn it over to Elena.
Thanks, George. And thanks for joining the September 16th, 2019 edition of EPA's Sustainable Materials Management Web Academy, also known as EPA's SMM Web Academy. We are glad you are participating today. This 60-minute webinar is hosted by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to provide training and a networking opportunity to state, local, and tribal governments, non-governmental organizations, and other stakeholders interested in sustainable materials management. The U.S. EPA estimates that more food reaches landfills and incinerators than any other single material in our everyday trash, constituting 22% of discarded municipal solid waste. This webinar will provide an overview of the state of Oregon's progress in implementing its strategic plan for preventing the wasting of food. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our two speakers, David Alloway and Elaine Blatt from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, also known as Oregon DEQ, or just DEQ. David is a senior policy analyst at DEQ's Material Management Program. He coordinates a variety of projects related to materials management, sustainable production and consumption, greenhouse gases, and life cycle analysis. A native of Oregon, David has a Bachelor of Arts in Physics from Carleton College. Elaine Blatt is also a Senior Policy and Program Analyst at Oregon DEQ. Her primary focus is on sustainable consumption and production of materials with an initial focus on preventing the wasting of food. Elaine has a Master's of Arts in Public Policy from the University of Chicago and a Bachelor in Arts in Political Science from Carleton College. Before we begin, please note the disclaimer on your screen. I'm going to pause for a second. And now I will turn it over to our speakers.
Okay, hold on while we show my screen. There we go. Is our screen showing up?
Yes.
Awesome. Then I'm going to put us on slideshow.
Why is it not working? There we go.
There we go. From the current slide. All right. Oops, we're backwards for some reason.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you. All right. We've had a few technical difficulties this morning, but I think we're now on our way. Hi, everyone. David and I are really pleased to be here today to talk about the work we're doing in Oregon to implement our strategy to prevent wasted food. In the short time available to us, we can only offer a brief overview of our work, but we'll provide some links to additional material where that's available. And we have planned time available at the end of our presentation to answer any questions you may have. But before we jump into our specific work, I wanted to just give a quick rundown of why Oregon considers wasted food such an important issue and why we've prioritized it. By now, I think most of you in the field are familiar with this data point that 25 to 40% of all food in the U.S. is never eaten. And the really important thing is that wasted food matters because it embodies resources that are lost when that food is not consumed. For example, it would take a farm 3/4 the size of the state of California to grow our wasted food, and all of the water used in Texas, California, and Ohio combined in a year to grow that food that we waste every day. If wasted food were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world after the US and China. Most people are now aware of the large amounts of greenhouse gases that are generated when wasted food is landfilled, and lots of attention is now being placed to keeping that wasted material out of landfills. But what's not more commonly known or appreciated is the much larger potential for reducing greenhouse gases that's available to us when we prevent food from being wasted to start with. In this graph, which is based on EPA WARM data, you can see the benefits of composting or diverting wasted food for anaerobic digestion, which is the sum of the landfill diversion impacts avoided and the benefits that are obtained through these processes. But what's important to see on this graph is the size of the potential source reduction benefits that are 6 to 7 times that of composting or anaerobic digestion. This potential derives from the greenhouse gases that are generated in the production phase of growing food in the first place. So what Oregon really wanted to do was change the conversation around wasted food. And why is that? Because we're essentially stuck at the bottom of the hierarchy, focusing most of our effort on preventing landfill disposal through composting and anaerobic digestion. And why are we stuck? I think it's because, in part, as a culture, we like technical fixes. For individuals, they're easy to implement, and they don't require us to make many changes in our everyday lives. Which leads me to my second point about why we're not getting out of the bottom of the hierarchy, and that's that, at least for the time being, reducing the generation of wasted food requires behavior change and systemic fixes that are harder to achieve. So we end up looking at the easy things that we can do and not looking upstream to source reduction. In our strategic plan, which we published 2.5 years ago, Oregon laid out a work plan to help move us up to source reduction and lay the foundations for the kinds of behavior and systemic change we need to change the conversation around the wasting of food. And now we're going to launch into talking about that work, and I'm going to turn it over to David, who will pick up the thread here.
All right. Happy Monday, everyone. So one of our very first big projects right out of the gate following adoption of the strategic plan was a baseline study to better understand the quantities and causes of wasted food in Oregon. This study was conducted by Community Environmental Services at Portland State University, and it was managed by Krista McDermott at PSU and Ashley Zanoli. The project had 2 tracks focusing on households and businesses. This was a very complicated and expansive study, and you can view all the results on the web pages shown here. In the interest of time, I'm going to highlight just a couple of key findings. The household track was rolled out in 3 phases. It started with open-ended interviews with 32 Oregon residents. That proceeded to a telephone survey of 486 Oregonians statewide. And the 3rd phase was an intensive study using mixed methods that tracked wasted food and wasted food behaviors in 299 households across the state using waste sorts, kitchen diaries, and both pre- and post-diary surveys. Our first and primary finding was that of all the food waste that Oregonians discard at the household level, 70% was food that could have been eaten at some point, leaving only 30% comprised of items we'd all recognize as stuff we could never eat. That comes to about 4.9 pounds per household weekly of edible food. And this provides some insight into how much potential might exist to reduce food waste. Among many solid waste professionals, I think there's a bias that the potential of prevention is small, in part because most food waste is inedible. We found that isn't true. Most of the waste is definitely not edible at the time it shows up at a compost facility. But at one point, most of it actually was edible, nutritious food, suggesting it could be targeted through prevention. From the waste sorts, you can see that among edible foods, vegetables and fruits contributed the most, followed by prepared foods and leftovers. And these top-level rankings were common across households in more as well as less urbanized areas of our state. And while I'm not going to show many survey results here, I do want to call out that the surveys and studies revealed very few statistically meaningful differences among different demographic cohorts. we expected to see some differences between respondents based on gender, household composition, income, or age. And in this study, we found surprisingly few differences, which suggests to us that perhaps the wasting of food is a more universal behavior across all segments of society. We asked kitchen diary participants to tell us for each wasted food item why it was wasted, and for both immediate as well as root loss reasons. So let me explain this. There were 11 reasons in each of these two groups, immediate and root. PSU performed a crosstabs analysis between the immediate and root loss reasons, and to create more robust cell sizes, they condensed responses into 3 immediate reasons. Either the food was thrown out because it was yucky, like it was moldy, or people were simply tired of eating it, or that it was difficult to reuse. The root loss reasons were consolidated into 4, shown here as the 4 colors on this graph. So what this graph shows is the number of times that a root loss reason was given when one of the immediate loss reasons was also given for a food item thrown out. Management problems, such as losing track of food in the refrigerator or scheduling changes, were cited the most often for food thrown away due to a yuck factor. That's that large aqua bar there on the left. Another common root cause in dark blue is that people seem to be making too much food in the first place. And this might also have some overlap with the root cause in dark green, which is food quantities being too large and not controllable. And an example of that would be packaging sizes being too large, which was a commonly reported problem among smaller households. That, they simply can't, they go to the grocery store and they buy the smallest loaf of bread available and it's still too large for them. So these results begin to point in the direction of a few possible solutions. And just to be clear, composting is not a clear solution to the problem of wasted food, wasted edible food. While composting is beneficial, our research seems to confirm what other researchers, such as Brian Rowe, are concluding. For example, in our pre-diary survey, more than 70% of respondents somewhat or fully agreed that the act of composting alleviates some sense of guilt associated with wasting food in the first place. And that alleviation of guilt has the potential of disabling some waste prevention behaviors and suggests to us the need for more careful messaging regarding the benefits of composting. So those are just a few of the study results. I've only barely scratched the surface, but in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the companion elements of this study, which were commercial case studies. Again, you can read more on our website. The commercial element of the study tested 15 food waste prevention techniques. At each site, our contractor evaluated waste types and causes, interviewed staff, recommended best management practices, and where possible, supported implementation and evaluation of environmental and cost impacts. Just as an example, in a hospital cafeteria, staff tracked data on the amount of entrees overproduced, and then used this data to make some adjustments. Rather than firing all of the entrees at the start of dinner, the kitchen staff started firing pans throughout the evening as needed, keeping other pans in refrigeration for use the next day if they weren't needed that evening. Better planning, smaller pans, and batch preparation, as I described, reduced the amount of unserved entree waste by 45% at this cafeteria. At a high-end restaurant, we documented annual cost savings of over $60,000 associated with the repurposing of meat and fish scraps from other entrees into empanadas and a rice and seafood entree. And you can read all 15 case studies on our website. But not every case study demonstrated successful implementation. Some prevention recommendations weren't implemented by these businesses, and this project unveiled a host of challenges and barriers which are summarized here. Food is often undervalued, unreasonable quality standards, the lack of staff training, a fear of running out, even a culture that accepts large amounts of waste as a cost of doing business. These and other barriers are quite common, and the report demonstrates these barriers, but more importantly, ways to overcome them. For example, caterers always fear running out of food and so tend to over-prepare. But we found that caterers almost always overproduce, in part because their clients consistently overproject the number of people who are going to show up at events. By keeping foods that are less perishable or are more easily repurposed in reserve, caterers can manage this shared fear of running out while reducing costs and wastes. Waste sorts at some of these sites also revealed wide divergence in the amount of food waste that was edible and potentially preventable, ranging from 34 to 82% of all food waste back of house, and of course higher in plate waste. As you would expect, most plate waste is edible and potentially preventable. So again, those are just some of the high-level results from the measurement study, and I'm going to hand it back to Elaine.
Thanks, David. So in addition to the foundational research that David just covered, we also got interested in issues related to food rescue, which occupies the second place in the hierarchy below source reduction. This interest grew out of engagement with the Oregon Food Bank and concerns they raised about the implications of treating food rescue as a means for managing excess food, as well as concerns about the potential for dumping food on rescue organizations as a means for dealing with that waste. Because we're DEQ, we of course decided to do some research and analysis to try to answer our questions about food rescue. We approached this study through two main considerations that you see here, environmental and social aspects. And first, we looked at the environmental benefits and trade-offs of different food rescue scenarios using life cycle assessment, which I'm going to get to in a moment. We also started digging into social benefits associated with food rescue by looking at the nutritional value and economic impacts of different types of rescued food. We learned a lot, and perhaps most importantly, that food systems are incredibly complex, and trying to address the range of issues and variables related to nutritional and economic benefits was going to be an impossibly heavy lift. So this prevented us from doing the full systematic evaluation that we'd hoped for. However, out of the interviews that we conducted with the Oregon Food Bank and other food rescue organizations, both inside and outside Oregon, we did learn a few important things I'd like to share with you right now. So here there are four main takeaways from our interviews that we think, paired with the environmental analysis that we'll cover in a minute, now inform our overall understanding of food rescue. The first is that the need for hunger relief has actually changed since food banking grew up about 30 years ago. So the paradigm for how we have to meet that need must change too. And what's different is that today people rely more on rescue food on a regular basis rather than as an emergency intervention, which leads to our second finding, and that's that the supply of recoverable food doesn't necessarily meet the current need. And we're not talking about volume here. Less nutritious calories are the most abundant and least costly to recover, so food rescue organizations find themselves awash in bread, cupcakes, and French fries. However, because food insecure people rely more on rescued food as a regular supplement to their diets, it's important that the food that they receive be nutrient rich. The Oregon Food Bank calls this food that's fit to be rescued. We also learned that hunger relief groups can and do use measurement metrics to help tell their story of this changing need, and we can rely on this data to help better understand rescue. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, food rescue organizations and their clients know their needs and how to find the solutions best. So we in the environmental world need to listen to them when we're talking about using food rescue to keep food out of landfills. Okay, there we go. All right. So now I'm going to turn back to the lane that DEQ is more comfortable in, and that's the assessment of environmental impacts, specifically here through life cycle assessment, or LCA. Before getting to the specifics of our LCA, I just wanted to give you all a very brief introduction to life cycle assessment, and my apologies to any LCA practitioners in the audience. This is going to be a really shallow dive into what is a fairly rigorous analytic approach, but here we go. LCA allows us to look at the impacts of a material like food at various points in its life cycle, from extraction of raw materials through manufacturing, transport, sale, and use, and finally disposal. It also allows us to quantify specific impacts associated with particular impact categories, like the ones you see here on the left, across a material's life cycle in a way that allows us to compare different scenarios for a particular material. So we applied the LCA process to look at various ways that excess food is collected and redistributed in order to determine if there were better or worse ways to do food rescue from an environmental standpoint. We looked at 8 impact areas, but to illustrate our results quickly, I'm just going to dig into a couple. And again, this is going to be a pretty shallow dive into results. Our report is not yet available on our website, but we expect to see it up in a week or two. We're waiting just for one final sign-off from a stakeholder. So let's look at global warming potential. Here are our results summarized on this slide. Across the bottom of the graph, you will see, sorry, we're trying to get, get that out of the way. So at the bottom of the graph, you will see the various rescue approaches we studied, from redistribution from farms by truck on the far left, to collection of prepared food from small food service businesses using an app and volunteers in single occupancy vehicles on the far right. A quick aside here I wanted to provide to let you know that we realized fairly early on that the impacts of these different collection approaches were strongly affected by how much food got wasted along the way, and there is waste at every stage of the food system. So we modeled different waste scenarios, and those results were reflected here in this graph. I'm just going to throw up some animation. So these blue bars show the range of global warming impacts for each type of rescue. The bottom of the bar represents the scenario with a 7% assumed waste rate, and the top represents a 20% waste rate. And now I'm going to add a line that helps illustrate which type of food rescue leads to net greenhouse gas benefits. That is, the cases where the benefits of avoiding disposal through rescue outweigh the impacts or cost of rescuing the food. Scenarios that fall below this line mean that greenhouse gas emissions of all the rescue activities tracked, transportation facilities, disposal of lost or wasted food, and so forth, were smaller than the benefits of avoided disposal. Conversely, scenarios that are above the line represent situations where emissions associated with the rescue activities were greater than the credits of avoided disposal. In some cases, you see scenarios that cross the line, as we have here in the scenario on the far left. What this shows us is the amount of rescued food that is ultimately wasted can be important in determining whether a given approach is environmentally beneficial. As waste increases, a given rescue scenario can switch from potentially environmentally beneficial to costly. To sum up, what you can see here is the two scenarios with the largest impacts are scenarios where food is rescued by car, and we'll talk more about the implications of that in a minute. But there are a number of scenarios that show that food rescue actually makes sense from an environmental standpoint. So now I'm just going to quickly show you the results for smog formation potential, more than anything else, just to illustrate that impacts will vary depending on the impact category you're interested in. Again, we see some scenarios resulting in net credits and others in net burdens, with some crossing the line, but crossing between the two as the amount of rescued food that is wasted increases. And here for smog formation potential, there are a couple more rescue approaches that result in net burdens as compared with greenhouse gas generation. So what can we conclude from these analyses? One, waste and loss matter most. Because of that, that waste is a significant driver of overall life cycle impact. So we should all work harder to reduce food loss across the entire life cycle. It always seems like we get back to prevention at DEQ. Second, we know that the mode and distance of transportation matter to the final impacts. The clearly least efficient means of transporting rescued food was by passenger vehicle. Third, the relevance of landfill diversion varies across impact category and waste scenario, so the benefit of diversion must be considered in proportion to the impacts of rescue activities. We did learn that the impacts of facilities and operations associated with rescue were consistently a very small contributor to the results. So the rescue organizations themselves are not contributing significantly to impacts. End-of-life disposition through landfill, anaerobic composting, incineration, or anaerobic digestion is of foods that is lost or wasted is often a small contributor to the life cycle impacts across all categories. However, it became meaningful for instances where loss or waste rates were high. And finally, as we noted at the beginning of this webinar, production impacts are really the thing that matter. When we include the upstream production of food and distribution in our analysis, the relevance of food rescue actually becomes quite minimal. Upstream production impacts really dominate the life cycle. Our work did allow us to generate some policy recommendations that we think can help refine how we think about food rescue. First, through our LCA, we found that it's not always environmentally beneficial to rescue food because sometimes the impacts associated with rescue activities outweigh the environmental benefits of keeping food from entering the landfill. And with that in mind, we have the following recommendations. First, as a general rule, it always makes sense to start at the top of the wasted food hierarchy when it comes to considering higher order goals related to environmental and social outcomes. Preventing the loss or wasting of food in the first place avoids environmental impacts before they happen, and preventing loss during the food rescue process greatly improves the environmental performance of all food rescue activities. When rescuing food, we should target foods that have higher nutritional value and foods that are most likely to be consumed. Rescuing every potentially edible food item that might otherwise be wasted leads to increased environmental impacts for the food system, while directing less nutritious food to hunger relief agencies that might not want them and may well dispose of them in the end. And finally, we should rescue foods using the most efficient mode of transport available and try to collect food as close to recipients as possible. Transporting, as I mentioned, food in personal vehicles proved the least efficient. To a lesser degree, traveling large distances in order to rescue food also increased impacts, even when done with a relatively efficient means of cargo transport. I will note that organizations like the Oregon Food Bank do try to reduce those kinds of impacts by backhauling to their partner organizations across the state. So I want to leave you with one final note about food rescue. We've pulled rescue out of the hierarchy here to illustrate one of our biggest learnings, and that's that food rescue is about feeding people. And when it's viewed primarily as a way to manage food waste, especially in the sense of a rescue all foods at all cost mindset, our local food banks end up with food they don't want, collected in a manner that has its own impacts and resulting in collection of food that ends up getting wasted. So in Oregon right now, we're rethinking about how we want to talk about food rescue in a more effective way. We haven't figured that answer out yet, but we continue working. And so now I'm going to turn it back to David.
All right. Thanks, Elaine. So you've heard about two really significant research projects that we're wrapped up. And now we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit more about some implementation, starting with our grants program. And the grants program here in Oregon is a modest and highly competitive program. It's around $500,000 per year that dates back to 1991. And in its first 17 years, we funded more than 300 projects around the state, of which only one of those 300 involved true food waste prevention. And this was a very successful pilot of the Lean Path food waste tracking system at 2 Intel cafeterias that achieved a 47% reduction in pre-consumer food waste. Well, we also gave multiple grants for edible food rescue as well as composting. The Intel cafeteria project was our only real wasted food prevention grant in 17 years. And then in 2017 and 18, while still keeping the grants open for other types of projects, we signaled our interest in wasted food prevention by awarding focus points. That is, your application could score extra points if it addressed food waste prevention. And that signal generated a pretty remarkable response. In 2017, we received 7 applications for food waste prevention projects, and we funded 6 of those, plus another 5 projects related to rescue. And in 2018, we funded 4 additional food waste prevention projects and another 4 rescue projects. And this shows, I think, that if you treat prevention like the priority the policy hierarchy says it is, then you can generate some real action and results. So here are 3 examples of those projects. First, the cafeteria at Southern Oregon University. Studies have shown that a reduction in plate size can reduce food waste, as patrons in a cafeteria setting are more likely to eat their portions on smaller plates, and of course they can always go back for seconds. Larger plates tend to increase food waste and wasted food as patrons take more food than they can actually consume. So our grant will help the university replace its 10.5-inch plates with 9-inch plates at the cafeteria. We don't have results yet, but expect from other universities to see some good reduction there. In Corvallis, we've funded an 18-month community outreach campaign that uses the EPA Food Too Good to Waste toolkit to build commitments and new habits to reduce wasted food. A variety of community engagement practices, along with prompts, such as an Eat Me First placard that is used in the refrigerator, food storage posters, and meal planners have been used with more than 8,000 residents contacted in this community. Overall, participating households have reduced their wasted food by 21%, and have reduced the money they spend on wasted food by 44%, which is a very impressive set of results. The third project I'll mention is one where we're funding some projects at schools in Marion County that builds on some pilot projects that came to us from Olympia, Washington, and Clackamas County, Oregon. This project involves replacing milk cartons in schools with fluid milk dispensers, allowing students to choose the amount and type of milk they want, of course within guidelines set by the federal school lunch program. Instead of pre-portioned individual cartons, the milk is served from a refrigerated dispenser into reusable cups that are washed. Now on the surface, if you work in the waste community, you might think that this is more about reducing single-use packaging, and it partially is. But the evidence from the pilot projects in Clackamas County here is that allowing students to choose their own portion size of milk also reduces waste, a 38% reduction in wasted milk at one school. And that's not something to cry over. The dispenser and reusable cups replace single-use cartons with cups that have to be made and washed with hot water. The milk dispenser also requires electricity to operate, and the milk comes in large plastic bags that have to be manufactured and then disposed of once you empty them. And how do these packaging considerations affect the outcome? Environmentally, is this actually a good choice? To answer that question, we conducted a streamlined life cycle assessment, and here's what we found. Here are 8 different types of environmental impacts across the bottom, and for each one, the carton and dispenser options are compared against each other. The dispenser option is always the best choice. That is, it always has the lower impact. And why is that? It turns out it has nothing to do with making the packaging or transportation or washing the reusable cups or keeping the milk cold or disposal of the packaging. It's all about the production of milk, shown here in blue. Food is so much more impactful to the environment than packaging. And this packaging reduction effort is beneficial primarily because it reduces the wasting of food. Specifically, the pilot project schools have reduced their purchases of milk that was being tossed out, by more than 100 gallons of milk per month at each school. That's an impressive result, and it's a good reminder that some of society's current angst and energy focused on packaging and packaging waste might be missing larger opportunities, such as reducing the environmental impacts of products, such as food. So we're hoping to expand this practice to other schools through our recent grant to Marion County. Elaine?
Thanks, David. So you heard David talk earlier in this webinar about the case studies that we developed that focused on commercial food service. DEQ has also implemented activity that directly engages commercial food service, and I want to take a couple of minutes to go over that work. The first activity I want to highlight is a campaign to encourage commercial food service businesses to reduce their food waste. This campaign, Wasted Food, Wasted Money, lays out the business case for reducing food waste, that case being that businesses can substantially improve their bottom line by reducing food waste. Some research suggests that businesses can realize a return of as much as 14 to 1 on every dollar that they invest in food waste prevention incentives. And you see here a flyer that comes from that campaign that lays out this business case, offers a 4-step approach that a business can implement, and access to other resources. Our campaign was designed to be implemented by local governments and includes a variety of creative collateral that they can use to reach out to businesses in their communities. This collateral includes resource guides tailored to restaurants, grocers, and institutional kitchens, as well as postcards, web and social media collateral. We also offer businesses guidance on how they can measure waste in their kitchens and use that information to target prevention activities. Material that David discussed from the case studies earlier will be used this year to refresh the commercial campaigns as we move forward this year. All of these materials are available on our website along with a guide to using them, and we encourage you to take a look at those. We're also very excited about a partnership opportunity we're engaged in with the Oregon Restaurant and Lodging Association, referred to as ORLA. DEQ was invited to join this partnership between ORLA and Oregon Metro. Metro is a regional governmental organization covering the Portland metropolitan area, so City of Portland and other local governments nearby. DEQ's participation extends the educational components of that partnership to other parts of the state. So under that partnership, we've supported the development of a website called Food Waste Stops With Me that is linked to Orla. This is a program that promotes prevention, rescue, and recovery of any remaining waste from restaurants and hotel kitchens. DEQ's prevention campaign is the foundation for the prevention piece of Food Waste Stops With Me. We're especially excited about workshops that we have supported around the state that directly help food service businesses to develop their own roadmaps to implement prevention activities that are tailored to the specific issues they face. These workshops use an approach developed by the World Wildlife Fund and published on the internet as Hotel Kitchen. So you can start to see how important partnerships are to the conduct of our work. To date, we've supported 4 workshops in the Portland area and have been the primary sponsor of workshops in Southern Oregon and Central Oregon. The photo here that you see is from our Bend workshop. A third workshop is being held on the North Coast on Wednesday, and plans are underway to deliver a similar workshop in Eugene. A key to the success of these workshops has been the active support of local governments, local trade and business associations, and nonprofits. And now I'm going to turn it back to David to talk about an important additional initiative we're working on related to grocers and food processors.
All right, thanks, Elaine. So moving from restaurants to grocery stores, this next project is still evolving and requires a little background to understand. So a couple of years ago, the states of California, Oregon, and Washington, along with the province of British Columbia, and the cities of Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, BC, came together under the auspices of a group called the Pacific Coast Collaborative to consider how we might reduce greenhouse gas emissions from food waste through regional collaboration. And out of those discussions came a joint work plan, a portion of which was registered by mayors, governors, and their staff at last year's Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco. Together, we've committed to achieving in our region the goal of 50% reduction of food waste by 2030, to implement programs within our jurisdiction with a focus on prevention, including prevention goals, and to work with industry to support voluntary agreements to do the same. And this last point was inspired by the Courtauld Commitments in the UK, a series of agreements, voluntary agreements, where industry worked across sectors and supply chains to measure, report, and act on food waste reduction. In its first 5 years, the UK reduced the wasting of edible food 19% nationwide. So, borrowing a page from that playbook, the government partners here are in the process of forming the West Coast Voluntary Agreement to Reduce Wasted Food. This is a partnership with World Wildlife Fund, ReFed, and RAF, the group that ran the successful UK program. We're currently recruiting retailers and hope to formally launch this initiative at ReFed's Food Waste Summit next month. Retailers are the initial focus of this project for a couple of reasons. Unlike restaurants and hospitality, there are relatively few retail businesses. They also sit at a critical juncture between consumers and suppliers. So, while we expect this project will reduce wasted food from retailers themselves, based on the UK experience, we also expect it will help realize reductions in consumer-level food waste as well, perhaps through changes in packaging or portion sizes, labels, and retailing strategy. For this to be realized, engagement with suppliers will also be critical, and this project is designed to encourage pre-competitive collaboration across the supply chain. Both retailers and suppliers are being recruited for this project. This is not just a waste audit program for retailers, but rather is intended to get at institutional and systemic drivers of wasted food. It is still emerging, although we have recently secured the commitment of Kroger, one of the nation's largest retailers, and many other retailers are actively considering signing up. We're in a recruitment phase right now. So stay tuned for more about this project. We hope to have some exciting results to share next year. And back to Elaine.
Thanks, David. So finally, I just want to end with some work that we recently launched and that we're quite excited about. Building on the household measurement work that David described, we are conducting market research to identify the most effective messaging to motivate Oregonians to reduce their wasted food. While most research to date has focused on consumer attitudes and specific behaviors, this work will delve into consumer values around food, waste, and sustainability to support the development of a messaging strategy that will drive consumers to take actions to reduce their wasted food. This work includes a combination of both qualitative and quantitative research. The qualitative work is going into the field day after tomorrow and will be used to build a strategy and inform the creation of a statewide campaign. That campaign will include elements that local governments will be able to use also to amplify the messaging in their communities. To our knowledge, this work represents the first rigorous quantitative market research done on this topic and fills an important gap. The need for research to support values-based messaging was recently highlighted in a meeting of the National Academy of Sciences on the topic of food waste, and we're very much looking forward to seeing the results. As with all DEQ's work, our research results will be made publicly available on our website. We expect the research phase of the work to be finished by the end of this year and anticipate rolling out a statewide campaign at the end of the first quarter of 2020. So that concludes our overview of Oregon's work. On behalf of David and myself, we'd like to thank you all for taking time out of your day to participate in this webinar, and I believe we have some time to take questions.
Great. Thanks, Elaine and David. Yes, we're going to move on to some questions. Just one to start with. How many staff does DEQ have approximately working on food waste prevention?
So we have, at present, we have a good chunk of my time and then a little bit of time from a couple of other staff people here. I do want to point out that we had, for the first about 2 years of implementing the strategy, we had Ashley Zanoli on detail for us from EPA. So we had an extra FTE for a while.
Okay. Thanks. Another question on slides 19 and 20 that have to do with the global warming potential and smog formation potential. What does the term S for retail to PA stand for? It's at the bottom of the graph.
We're going back to find it.
Yes. Slides 18 and 19.
Yeah, it's a technical thing about smog formation. Which is not
it's retail to PA and retail to FB. Oh. These are the scenarios.
Yes. Oh, you know, okay.
FB is food bank.
Yeah, so retail to FB is the scenario that's retail to food bank, and retail to PA is a function of the way things are done here in the state of Oregon, which is retail to partner agencies. Our Oregon Food Bank actually, while located in the city of Portland, has partner agencies all across the state, and they arrange for transportation of donations directly to those partner agencies, and they don't all funnel through their main office here.
Yeah, and so it makes sense that if you can collect food at the retail level and take it directly to the partner agency, then the impacts of that are going to be lower than if you collect the food from the retailer, bring it to the food bank, and have the food bank sort through it, and then put it on another truck and drive it to the partner agency. This is simply a function of one leg of transportation as opposed to two.
Yeah, and that definitely led to one of our recommendations, as you'll recall, that it's best to transport things over as little distance as reasonably possible.
Okay. What was the buy-in like at the schools piloting the milk dispensers? Did you face any hesitation from the schools themselves?
That's a great question, and I have to say that we have not been directly involved in working with the schools. So what I've heard is the pilot projects in Clackamas County were run by staff from Clackamas County, a county government, working with the Canby School District initially. They actually have a little video on their website. I'm sorry I don't have a link here, in which the school nutrition service director talks about it. She's very enthusiastic. She really liked the program. Kids liked the program as well, because they like being able, I mean, there's this evidence that goes back decades about how if you give kids choices and some control over food portioning, not only do they waste less, but they also eat better. And so the response that we've heard anecdotally has been very positive. It's possible there was some resistance, and if there was, that wasn't shared with us. Similarly, the pilot projects that we're funding in Marion County, inspired by the Clackamas County pilot projects, we're not directly involved in those. Elaine and I are not out there talking with the schools, so I can't tell you what the kind of attitude or response has been. I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks. Is food date labeling planned to be part of the effort to reduce wasted food for Oregon DQ?
That's a really good question, and it's a complicated question. So our own research, and David didn't actually have time to report on all of these data points out of our measurement study. Our own research and survey results suggest to us that that date labeling may be less important than has been advertised. Specifically, what we found is that people tended to use date labels to purchase highly perishable items like meat and dairy. But then in survey questions anyway, our survey respondents told us that generally speaking, when they're trying to figure out whether or not a food is still good to eat, they're still using the good old-fashioned approach, which is to smell it, taste it, or look at it. We are watching closely the development of more standard date labeling coming out of the Food Marketing Institute and Grocery Manufacturing Association, and we may pursue looking at how those new labels are working out in the state of Oregon and whether or not they're causing similar confusion, but that remains to be seen.
Yeah, just to build on what Elaine said, it's when it comes to people using date labels to decide whether or not to throw food out, there are some people who are still going that route. So the sniff and smell test is the most commonly used method, but there's a percentage of Oregonians who are still using those date labels. What we were not really able to get at through our research was whether or not they're reading the labels appropriately, whether they're understanding what the labels actually mean, or whether they're assuming the labels mean one thing when in fact they mean something else. So specifically here, how many people are interpreting a Best By date to imply that the food is no longer healthy or safe to eat and should be thrown out? I don't think we got to that through the research. So to be determined, as Elaine said.
Okay, thanks. What is the role of agricultural production activities in reducing food waste, or these efforts?
I'm sorry, what's the question again?
The question is about the role of agricultural production in the state in terms of reducing food waste.
What's the role of on-farm production? Okay, yeah. So that's a really insightful question because there are significant data gaps. It doesn't get reported to us, and like all of our peers across the country, the solid waste tracking and the statistics we use don't count, for the most part, on-farm food waste. ReFed has done some initial analysis into this, and it suggests that there is on-farm food waste, but it is not as large in this country. Not true in some other places of the world, but it's not as large as food waste from the commercial sector and from households. So our strategy is really focused primarily on the larger sources of waste, which are commercial and households. The grants program that we've run has funded some projects that have gone after on-farm food waste, primarily to support gleaning efforts. And I think the retail projects through the Pacific Coast Collaborative certainly has the potential of reaching up into agricultural practices, but in a way that is very helpful. And I think maybe I'll share an anecdote that came to us through RAP about the UK program, just to give an example of how this could work. So in the UK RAP program, through the Courtauld commitments, they started working with grocery stores, and what they were finding as they were evaluating the waste from grocery stores is that there were a lot of potatoes being tossed out by the produce departments because they were bruised. And so someone asked the question, well, why are these potatoes bruised? And the answer came back from the retailer. It was like, well, I don't know, these potatoes always bruised. There's nothing we can do about it. So they started digging deeper, and they discovered that the potatoes were bruising because it was characteristic of the specific varietal of potatoes. These were fingerling potatoes that were being sold. This particular variety of potatoes was prone to bruising, and if they're bruised, people won't buy them, so they were tossing them out. So then they asked the question, well, why are you choosing this specific variety of potatoes? And the answer was, well, we need to, because this is the only variety of potatoes that consistently grows large enough to meet the marketing standards. And it's like, well, what are those? It's like, well, the marketing standards require that fingerling potatoes put on the market have to have a circumference of something, 25 millimeters or something like that. And so then they asked the question, well, where did that come from? And no one knew. And they dug back through the archives of history and found that several decades prior, someone had come up with this number of 25 millimeters. And so then the folks from RAP asked the question, well, could we reduce the circumference, the diameter, the size of these fingerling potatoes? And the initial response from the retailers was, well, no, you can't do that because people won't buy small fingerling potatoes. It's like, they're fingerling potatoes, they're supposed to be small. So they agreed to do a pilot project where they reduced the diameter of the potatoes slightly, and they discovered that people still bought them. And the most remarkable thing was that this allowed the farmer in this pilot project to switch to a different variety of potato. And this different variety of potato, not only did it not bruise as much, but it could be grown with much higher yields while requiring less water, less fertilizer, and a smaller amount of pesticides, such that it increased the net profit to the farmer by a remarkable amount of money. I think it was like 10,000 pounds per hectare or some ridiculous quantity like that. It was a total win for the farmer, but it could never have happened if the retailer and the farmer hadn't been talking with each other. So there is on-farm food loss and food waste, but there are also practices that farmers engage in, sometimes because retailers require them to, that result in food loss and waste down the supply chain.
Thanks, David. Another question that came in asked if the consumer messaging campaign will look at pairing climate change benefits with reducing wasted food.
That is a really good question. And in fact, that's precisely what our research is intended to get at, which is trying to identify the kinds of messages, whether they be environmental or not, that people will latch onto when they think about wasting of food. So the short answer is the research will answer these questions for us, we hope. And if it turns out that linking wasted food to climate change is the right way to encourage people to reduce food waste, then we would definitely go in that direction.
And if the research shows that it isn't the right way, then we'd go in that direction too, right? I mean, we'll go
wherever the research leads us. Another important thing that I'm excited about in the research is that in addition to identifying the messaging that we think will be most effective, our contractors are also going to be trying to tease out language that isn't particularly effective. And we may find out, that environmental messaging kind of leaves people feeling flat about food waste, but we don't know that.
Right. And of course, it goes without saying, I'll say it anyways, there's a distinction to be made between public messaging and policy motivation. As the state's environmental agency, we're highly motivated by the environmental potential, including but not limited to the greenhouse gas reduction potential of wasted food prevention. However, the public response doesn't change the underlying scientific reality here, but we're not assuming that just because climate gets Elaine and I all excited, that's going to work for the public as well. We just don't know yet.
Thanks, David. There's a question about tracking progress and how you plan to track progress against the 50% reduction target. Are you going to be using municipal solid waste data and/or repeating household studies?
Yeah, great question. So the 50% reduction target, consistent with EPA's interpretation of it, is a disposal reduction target. So all the upper tiers of the hierarchy, prevention, rescue, and recovery, all contribute to that 50% reduction. We're going to be tracking our progress at achieving that goal through waste data. And that waste data includes tonnage data about the amount of waste going to landfill and incineration, as well. In this case, it will be simply tonnage data going to landfill and incineration. We have a baseline. The base year is 2015. We have annual tonnage reports. We do periodic waste composition studies, and we'll use those waste composition studies to track the amount of food waste disposed of and compare them to the 2015 baseline. The household studies were helpful for a number of reasons. We're not entirely convinced yet that they need to be repeated, particularly given the high cost associated with going out and recruiting the households and sorting the waste from the individual households. So whether or not we do household studies again, I think is to be determined. We don't need to do it, however. We don't need to do household studies to track progress. And of course, the household studies are only households, which is only a portion of the waste stream, whereas the waste disposal data is the whole kit and caboodle. It's comprehensive. I will also add that our waste composition study in recent years has taken to not only separating food waste from other wastes, it is taken to further speciating food waste into edible versus not edible. Again, this is not edible versus inedible at the point of time that the waste is sorted, because that's gross and incredibly unuseful information. This is edible versus inedible at the point of generation, and the, you might, it's not at the point of disposal or the point at which the materials were put in the bin, because we have no idea if the mold is old mold or new mold. It's simply that pizza, and pieces of fruit, whether they are spoiled at the time we sort them or not, were edible food at one point, whereas eggshells and chicken bones and cantaloupe rinds were never edible. And so it's not that difficult in the field to distinguish edible versus inedible foods the way we define them.
Thanks. And for the last question, can you quickly tell us, does DEQ have any case studies or grant reports with the results that you presented today, such as the savings from the smaller plates or the milk dispensers?
The smaller plate project hasn't completed. None of the 3 grant projects that I've mentioned have completed yet, so we don't have reports on them. And the reports we do have, with the exception of the Intel case study, which inexplicably was removed from our website and we need to get it back up, but I can email it to anyone who sends me an email. The address is here on the screen. Those reports exist in the form of reports that the grantees submitted to us. They're not on our website, they're in our files. But as we, again, it was only back in 2017 that we really started funding these waste prevention projects. So some of them haven't even completed yet. I think, Elaine, help me out here. As we start getting actual results, as the final reports come in and the grants are completed, we're going to be doing more documentation of results in a more public accessible form. Right.
And, and then packaging the results in a way that makes them easier, as David said, for the public to see and potentially put on our website.
So that's coming, but we don't have them up yet.
Fantastic.
Except for Intel, where we have this beautiful case study, which we'd be happy to share if you want it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We wish to thank our 2 speakers, David and Elaine, for sharing their knowledge and time with us today. We thank you for joining today's EPA SMN Web Academy and hope that you can join us again in the future. We will post the webinar audio in about 2 weeks. Please complete our evaluation at the end to share feedback on how we can make these webinars more worthwhile. We invite you to join us for next month's October 16th webinar on electronic waste generation and management and the cost of digitalization to the environment. Look for an email next week for registration details. This concludes today's session. Thank you so much.